We're delighted to welcome our chair, Ambassador David Puig. He's ambassador of the Dominican Republic in India and is active in his country's cultural and literary scene as an author, translator, and publisher. In 2010, he launched, I'm sorry for my mispronunciation, Ediciones de A Poco, a publishing house focused on contemporary literature and art books from the Caribbean. And he's also translated the work of the Maharashtrian poet Arun Kolatkar into Spanish. Sir? He will introduce this session and the speakers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Welcome you all to this session 2, dedicated to the relations between the Caribbean region and India. The last presentation of the previous session was, I think, a good introduction to this session and put us through the music and the relations in the musical sphere between India and the Caribbean in the right mood for this panel. First of all, I have to say I'm particularly happy to be chairing a panel with 3 fellow Caribbeans. We are 2 from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean region and 2 from the English-speaking Caribbean. And this is something that, as I said, makes me particularly happy because, unfortunately, in our region, because of its fragmentation, because of the difficulties of traveling between one island and the other, we hardly get the occasion to meet, and we hardly get the occasion to discuss. So I'm really happy that this is happening here at India International Center. So the Caribbean and India. At first sight, 2 very remote and different spaces, separated by geography. Still today, to travel from this part of the world to the Caribbean, we need 1 full day, 24 hours. And goods need at least 30 days to move from one of the ports of India to one of the ports of the Caribbean region. 2 regions also separated by their nature, of course. One is a subcontinent, a continent. Our region, the Caribbean, is a sea. So we have in one side an extended landmass, and in the other, I will say, small dots of land in the Caribbean Sea. And of course, distinguished by their populations, 1.4 billion people in India and around 40 million people in the Caribbean region. But also 2 regions that have been characterized by the cultural diversity as places of encounters, where humans from various cultures, languages, religions have converged over the centuries. Crossroads, palimpsest, multiculturalism are the words that come to mind when we think of both regions. Those composite cultural societies have been the result of migrations, trade, but also violent encounters with the other. In the modern period, both regions were coveted by the European colonial powers. And it was one of those powers, the British Empire, that was responsible for linking directly for the first time the Caribbean and India. In the 19th century, in a proto-globalized world, the movement of workers between India and the Caribbean, known as the indentured labor, brought Indians to the Caribbean, and with them, the Indian cultural component was added and integrated into a region. We have today with us Tota Mangar and Shalima Mohammed, 2 distinguished intellectuals from the Caribbean who will be speaking about the presence from the 19th century to today of the Indian component in Guyana and Jamaica. How did Indians came to the region? How and why did they remain? How their presence has evolved, blending with the other components of the Caribbean society. Spirituality, ideas, and literature have been the second important connection between India and the Caribbean. We know of the impact of spiritual ideas from India in the Caribbean region and in the Latin American region at large since the end of the 19th century. In literature, the figure of Tagore has had a major impact in all the Latin American and Caribbean countries. But there are stories that are less well known about the reception of Tagore in the Caribbean region. The case of the scholar from the Dominican Republic, Pedro Enrique Sureña, about whom José Mármol will speak briefly in his presentation, or the Dominican poet Delia Weber, who in the Dominican Republic in the mid-20th century was a huge fan of Tagore, I would say, and wrote books about his works. Indian spirituality, in particularly Buddhism, is present in the whole work of the Cuban writer Severo Sarduy, for example. And this exchange has been in both directions, has not been only Indian ideas traveling to Latin America and the Caribbean. Poets and writers from Latin America and the Caribbean have been widely read and influential in India. It is not unusual to meet today contemporary writers from India that express their admiration for Caribbean writers and for other writers from Latin America. And I think of particular of the case of Atish Taseer, whose work I really admire, and he has repeatedly expressed the importance of V.S. Naipaul in his intellectual development and how he considers him as a mentor. And of course, magical realism with Garcia Marquez from Colombia, but also with figures like Alejo Carpentier from Cuba, have been essential to a generation of readers and writers in India. Post-colonial fiction in India will definitely not have the shape that it has without magical realism. And we will hear from the poetic genesis of this aesthetic in Latin America and the Caribbean from the Dominican poet José Mármol. He will tell us how the language and the cosmovision of magical realism is rooted in and indebted to the poetry that was being developed in a region, in the Caribbean, in the first decade of the 20th century. As you can see, we have an exciting menu ahead for this session. We have, I think, 1 hour, so maximum 20 minutes by each of the panelists. If they can do it in 15 minutes, it will be even great, so that we can have a little bit of dialogue with the public. So we will first hear Tota Mangar, then Shalima Mohammed, and we will conclude the panel with José Mármol. So, Mr. Mangar, you have the floor. For sake of brevity, I will not read your bio. Everyone has it, and I'll ask you to go directly into the text.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Puig. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to sincerely express my deepest gratitude to the IIC and ICCR for providing me with the opportunity to come here and make this presentation at this conference. I'm very humbled by the occasion. Thanks very much. My paper is entitled Guyana-India Relations, 1838 to Present Time, The Ties That Bind and Solidify. Guyana's relationship with India could be traced back to the 1830s, when both countries were part of the once powerful British Empire. Following the abolition of the despicable system of slavery in 1834, and more so the termination of the apprenticeship scheme in 1838, a state of fear, uncertainty, and gloom was uppermost in the minds of the then British planters. They were very conscious that a grave labor shortage on the estates would certainly mean economic disaster to themselves and the sugar industry in general. The mass exodus of ex-slaves from the plantations during that crucial period of crisis, experiment, and change merely served to confirm planters' fear and uneasiness. In the wake of this development, planters immediately set about the reconstruction of their labor force. The importation of Indian indentured laborers was part of the continuing search for a reliable labor force to meet the needs of the powerful plantocracy. This influx in the Caribbean in the post-emancipation period of the 19th and early 20th centuries was also part of a wider movement of Indian laborers to other parts of the world, including Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Fiji, the Strait settlements, Natal, and other parts of the South African continent. Overall, where the English-speaking Caribbean is concerned, substantial numbers of indentured laborers were imported. Based on statistical evidence, Guyana was the recipient of 238,909 East Indian immigrants up the termination of the system in 1917. Trinidad, 143,939, Jamaica, 36,412, Grenada, 3,333, St. Vincent, 4,354, and St. Kitts, 337. In addition, the non-English-speaking Caribbean also imported indentured laborers. Of the French colonies, now overseas departments, Martinique received 25,509, Guadeloupe 45,844, and French Guyana 19,276. Suriname, while under Dutch rule, imported a total of 35,501 immigrants. In the case of Guyana, East Indian immigration had its origin in the Gladstone experiment. John Gladstone, the father of British statesman William Gladstone, was the owner of West Demerara plantations, Vredenhoop and Vredenstein, at this juncture of our country's history. As a result of the acute labor problem, John Gladstone wrote the Calcutta recruiting firm Gillanders, Arbuthnot and Company, inquiring about the possibility of obtaining Indian indentured laborers for his estates. The firm's prompt reply was that it envisaged no recruiting problems and that Indians were already in service in another British colony, Mauritius. Subsequently, Gladstone obtained permission for his scheme from both the Colonial Office and the Board of Control of the East India Company. The first batch of Indian indentured laborers arrived in Guyana on board the steamships Whitby and Hesperus in May 1838, and these first arrivals were on a 5-year contract. This initial experimentation was not confined to Gladstone's 2 estates, but involved plantations Highbury and Waterloo in Berbice, Bellevue, West Bank Demerara, and Anna Regina on the Essequibo coast as well. From then on, with the exception of a brief period of suspension between July 1839 and 1845, due to numerous abuses and vigilance of the Anti-Slavery Society, the immigration scheme continued virtually uninterrupted until its termination in 1917, by which time 238,909 Indians landed in Guyana. Of this figure, 75,547 returned to the land of their birth, while the remainder who survived the system made Guyana their homeland. The system of Indian indentureship could be characterized as one of intense struggle, supreme sacrifice, and persistent resistance. It was closely linked to slavery. For example, British historian Hugh Tinker, who did extensive work on East Indian labor overseas, described it, and as I quote, a new system of slavery. Anthony Trollope, who visited the Caribbean in the 1850s, viewed it as, and I quote, a despotism tempered with sugar, end of quote. Chief Justice in the second half of the 19th century, Charles Beaumont, aptly describes it as, and I quote again, a rotten, monstrous system rooted in slavery, end of quote. The late Walter Rodney highlighted the harshness of the indenture system and its neo-slave nature. Bastille Mangru argues that slavery and indentureship showed remarkable similarities in terms of control, exploitation, and degradation. From the very inception, the indentureship system was plagued with controversy. Recruits were disposed to respond to promises of glowing opportunities, better times, good life, and what they perceived as greener pastures, are portrayed by the professional recruiting agents. Recruiters exploited their ignorance and simplicity. Some were hoodwinked, cajoled, and lured to leave their homes, while some were even kidnapped. Indeed, fraud, deceit, and coercion permeated the whole recruiting system between 1838 and 1917. Against tremendous odds, the immigrants struggled for their survival on board ship while crossing the Kalapani. Overcrowding of immigrant ships, inadequate food, lack of fresh water, waterborne diseases such as cholera, dysentery, and diarrhea, and the long and arduous voyage made life unbearable. In some instances, there were a relatively high mortality rate. Immigrants consoled themselves through singing, drumming, and storytelling, and of a much greater significance was the bonding and lasting friendship that developed among jihadis or shipmates. On the estates, the powerful plantocracy had effective control of the immigrant labor force. Labor laws weighed heavily against the indentured laborers. The implementation of the laws and the period of industrial residence were taking place thousands of miles from the laborers' homeland and in a social and political environment dominated by the employer. It was not surprising that the laws were varied and very much abused by the plantocracy to suit their whims and fancies. Of added significance, some of the immigration agent generals, stipendiary magistrates, and official interpreters tended to side with planters. As a result, cases of intimidation, assault, and battery were often covered up. Throughout the period of indentureship, immigrants were faced with meager wage rates and unrealistic tasks. Weekly earnings depending on the number of tasks, the nature of the task, whether it was weeding, shoveling, manuring, planting, or harvesting, and the speed with which they were completed. In any event, it was the employer who determined the wage rate, and whenever there was a fall in sugar prices, immigrants found their wages minimized. One immigrant agent was baffled to know how plantations and plantation bellier existed due to insufficient earnings to support life. Why Kuljar, a spokesman for the immigrants, was quoted as saying, and I quote, "Times are hard. We cannot live on the wages we are getting. Our bellies are not being filled." End of quote. The Indian immigrants often went before the courts as victims of the labor law and the legal system in general. The planter had at his disposal several instruments of prosecution. He could prosecute for refusal to commence work, or work left unfinished, absenteeism without authority, disorderly or threatening behavior, or even neglect. Punishment resulted in fines or imprisonment. At the same time, convictions of indentured laborers were inordinately high. Charges could be made on mere orders of managers and for even trivialities. In 1863, for example, of the 4,936 prisoners who were in the Georgetown jail, 3,148 were indentured laborers. Moreover, the period 1877 to 1894 showed an alarmingly high figure of 65,084 convictions of immigrants for breaches of the labor contract. This development reinforced the fact that the indentured laborers were far from docile. They were struggling, sacrificing, and resisting. The numerous instances of cases under the labor contract were ample proof of their restlessness and non-compliance with a harsh and oppressive system. Resistance. It was not surprising that from the 1860 onwards, the myth of Indian docility was to be seriously challenged. The indentured laborers began to openly defy the system. This can be viewed against the sepoy mutiny back in their homeland. As a consequence, there was a steady deterioration of industrial relations, increasing working class protests, and imperial investigation. Violent eruptions were occasioned by many specific and localized grievances, such as overbearing behavior of managers, wage rate disputes, disagreement over tasks, sexual exploitation of women by managers, and the arbitrary deduction of wages of laborers. The first such disturbance took place at Plantation Leonora, West Coast, Demerara, in 1869, and this was followed by violent eruptions at Plantation Hague, Iflut, Monrepo, Nonpareil, Sealocht, Virgin Union, and Success in 1870. Another major disturbance took place at Plantation Devonshire Castle in 1872. This time there were confrontation with colonial police and the loss of lives of our forest indentured martyrs. Riots and deaths continued with regularity in the 1890s and in the early years of the 20th century. And it is significant to note that a mere 4 years before the termination of the scheme, 15 laborers at Plantation Rose Hall lost their lives at the hands of colonial police. Termination of indentureship. The movement for the end of the indentureship system emerged both within the colonies and in India itself. Atrocities were highlighted in newspapers in South Africa, Mauritius, Guyana, Trinidad, and other British colonies. In the case of Guyana, stipendiary magistrate George William Devoe, in a 133-paragraph letter to the Colonial Office, highlighted the deplorable conditions facing the indentured Indians, and this prompted a Royal Commission of Inquiry in 1870. This commission subsequently recommended appropriate changes in the system. Also, more spokesmen were emerging and were clamoring for improvements. The anti-indentured campaign intensified in India itself. Mahatma Gandhi in May 1901 wrote a letter calling for action in the Indian legislature to improve the conditions of indentured laborers in South Africa, following his traumatic experience with the apartheid system there. Also, through speeches, petitions, pamphlets, and newspaper coverage, the issue was kept alive, and the Indian government found it increasingly difficult to defend a system which aroused so much bitterness among articulated and educated Indians and a growing public opinion. Enlightened viceroys, Lord Curzon and Lord Hardinge, called the whole indenture system into question. Indian nationalist leaders such as Gandhi, Gokhale, and Mohammed Jinnah argued that indentureship was an affront to the national honor of India and it should be abolished. By 1915, the indenture issue had become a central question in Indian politics. F. Andrews, a missionary and a disciple and a close friend of Gandhi, denounced the immorality of indentureship in a similar way to that of William Wilberforce during the abolition and emancipation era. He wrote, and I quote, "It is difficult to catch the bad planter. He slips through all regulations. The planter has money, class interests, cleverness, and education on his side. The coolie has no chance." End of quote. At the same time, Indian politicians were also quick to highlight the numerous deaths of indentured laborers as a result of strikes and other forms of protests in the colonies. In the end, Pandit Malivia moved a resolution in the Indian legislature to end the indentureship system. The Colonial Office subsequently authorized the Government of India to issue the Defense of India Act to stop recruitment. This was officially effected in the Indian legislation on March 12, 1917, thus abolishing Indian migration to other parts of the world, including Guyana. Post-indentureship period. In the immediate post-indentureship period, there were continuing efforts to revive some level of Indian immigration to Guyana. A delegation comprising Attorney General Joseph Noonan and J.A. Locke visited India in 1919 in connection with a proposal for a colonization scheme, but it did not get the desired response. Nonetheless, an Indian delegation consisting of D1 Pillai, Vice President of the Madras Legislative Council, Venkatesh Tiwari of the Servants of India Society, and C.F. Keatings, Director of the Agriculture of Bombay, visited Guyana in February 1922. However, it gave very little support to further immigration, largely on account of falling sugar prices, which was felt to be a setback to improve living conditions for new Indian settlers. A second mission headed by Sir Noonan in 1923-24 and with modified proposals was accepted by resolution of the Government of India in June 1924. In October 1925, it sent Kunwar Maharaj Singh, a deputy commissioner in the United Province to examine the economic and political conditions of Indians in Guyana. In his report, Singh acknowledged that the Indian community was making progress due to the qualities of industry and thrift, and he proposed an experiment involving the settlement of Indian families in Guyana. The Indian imperial government finally approved the immigration proposals, and a total of 173 Indians arrived under the new scheme in 1926. However, the British government found the cost of transportation too high, and this experiment quickly petered out. According to Mangar, the scheme was stifled at birth. By this time, it was obviously clear that the Indian immigrants had ensured that their customs, values, cultural, and religious traditions all flourished in Guyana. They had great pride in their Indianness, and they created an identity based on jihadi bhai. This in itself was to lay the foundation for the strengthening of ties with India. Guyana's foremost political leaders, Dr. Cheddi Jagan and Mr. Forbes Warren, were influenced by the Indian independence movement and the role of its national leaders, and in particular, the Gandhian philosophy. The late 1940s onwards witnessed a greater advocacy for internal self-government and political independence. With the suspension of the Constitution and the overthrow of the legally elected People's Progressive Party government in 1953, ostensibly to prevent the establishment of a communist state in the only British colony on the South American continent, it is significant to note that Guyana's deposed political leaders fittingly and promptly visited the Indian subcontinent. They met then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and addressed members of both houses of parliament and had public meetings in several cities while presenting their case for support and moderation from the Indian government and its people in their quest against British colonial oppression. In India, their public engagements received maximum press coverage. Dr. Jagan himself revealed, and I quote, "Wherever we went, we were warmly received, sometimes with great pomp and ceremony," end of quote. Post-independence period. Now, the post-independence period ensured a strong improvement in relations between the two states. First of all, diplomatic relations were established through a commission of inquiry in 1965, and by 1968, a full-fledged Indian High Commission came into being. The same year witnessed the visit of the third Prime Minister of India, Srimati Indira Gandhi. At a welcoming ceremony, she was impressed with the warmth and affection with which she was received, and she aptly reminded our audience, and I quote, "We are bound not only by ancient historical ties, but also because we face common problems and common challenges." For his part, Prime Minister of Guyana then, Mr. Forbes Warren, acknowledged the impact of the Indian nationalist movement on the local scene when he said, "Our struggle had drawn strength from the greatness of your leaders, from the powerful moral force and the teaching of the Mahatma." International organization. Guyana and India over the years view each other as strategic partners, and to this end, they cooperate with each other on the international arena. At an early stage, Guyana recognized the significant role played by India through its Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, in the formulation of the non-aligned movement during the critical Cold War era. There is clear convergence of views on issues of mutual interest at the Commonwealth and United Nations. Guyana has consistently recognized India's leading role against apartheid and in articulating economic concerns of developing countries at the United Nations. It is supportive of India's candidature at the international forum. For example, it supports India for the non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council for 2021-22, and more recently, it voted for India's candidates on the Council of International Telecommunications Union and its Radio Regulations Board. High-profile visits. A number of high-profile visits took place between the two countries. Prime Minister Burnham visited India in 1971, Arthur Chung in 1975, President Cheddi Jagan in 1993, Var Jagyev in 2013, Donald Ramotar in 2015. On the other hand, Vice President Dr. Shankar Dayal Sharma visited in 1988, In that case, he led a 156-member delegation at our genesis of the one celebration to mark our 150th anniversary of Indian arrival in Guyana, in comprised of academicians, musicians, dancers, and film stars. Other visits that have taken place within the recent years, Prime Minister Sam Hinds attended the International Session on Energy in 2012. Former President Bar Jagdeo participated in the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit in 2012. Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu attended the inaugural World Tamil Conference in Pondicherry in 2018. Acting Chancellor of the Judiciary, Minister of Public Security attended the 19th International Conference of Chief Justice in Lucknow. President Granger participated in the founding conference of International Solar Alliance in New Delhi in 2018. Second Vice President and Minister Carl Greenidge and Natural Resource Minister Raphael Tratman had bilateral meetings in 2018. Foreign Minister Todd attended the Raisina Dialogue in 2022. Other areas of collaboration with India, the role of the Indian Culture Center, which is now renamed the Swami Vivekanand Culture Center. That's very important. The center conducts regular classes in dance, music, yoga, Hindi, and Sanskrit. It also offers cooking, sari draping, demonstration, and fortnightly movie screening as part of its expanded domain of activities. We also have the role of top Indian artists visiting Guyana. Leading playback singers Mohammed Rafi, Geeta Dutt, Mukesh Chand Mathur, and Lata Mangeshkar visited. Their performances attracted thousands and created mass excitement. More recently, in 2014, a Bhojpuri music troupe came under the aegis of the ICCR. Role of monuments. Monuments also played a significant role. We have the Mahatma Gandhi Monument at the Promenade Gardens. We have the Donalai Monument, which included the founder fathers, including Jawaharlal Nehru. We have the Indian Immigration Monument, founded by the Indian Commemoration Trust in the Monument Gardens at Camp Street. We have the Indian Arrival Monument. This is located at Palmyra, East Kanji region, and was designed by Guyanese architect Philbert Gajadar. India and the University of Guyana. India continues to contribute meaningfully to the development of the University of Guyana. From as early as the 1970s, a few highly qualified Indian academicians came to Guyana and joined the staff of the university as lecturers in various fields. Today, I'm proud to say that the director of the Tain Borbis campus, India, is an Indian national, Professor Subramanian Gomatingam. He started as a lecturer at our university, and now he's the director of the Tain Borbis campus. Indian technical cooperation is another area. Yes, and I just want to highlight some other areas of cooperation. We have the Guyana Online Program, and thanks to institutions like the Indira Gandhi University, thousands of students within the last 2 years have done short-term courses online. Pravasi Bharatiya Samman awardees, a number of Guyanese received those awards, including recently in January, our president, Dr. Irfan Ali, and also including the Guyana Hindu Dharmic Sabha, which is a leading Hindu organization in Guyana. Indian nationals are employed in an array of services in Guyana, not only the University of Guyana. A number of them are attached to private hospitals. Some are also in the private sector. I just want to single out one, Mr. Pravindra Dev. He was one time our manager of the Bank of Baroda, Guyana local branch. Now he's the chief executive officer of our indigenous bank, Demerara Bank, which is a major achievement. Cricket. Cricket has proven to be of considerable socio-cultural connection between the two countries. We remember well Rohan Kanai's majestic 256 at Eden Garden, Clive Lloyd's 242 at Wankedi in 1975, Falk Bakker's 250 at Kanpur. On the other hand, visiting Indian test teams are seemingly receiving more crowd support than our regional team whenever they are in Guyana. Guyanese vividly remember Little Master Sunil Gavaskar 2 centuries at border, along with the heroics of Rahul Dravid and Sachin Tendulkar. Today, top Guyanese cricketers are in high demand in the hugely lucrative and popular IPL. For example, Shemron Hetimaya, Kimopal, Charlene Rutherford. India and COVID relief. We received tremendous help from India thanks to Prime Minister Modi's generosity in terms of COVID shield vaccines and also ventilators and thousands of protection equipment. Economic assistance. This is a strong area. I'm pressed for time, but time is running out. But this is a strong area of linkage with India. We have received tremendous economic assistance through lines of credit. For example, the building of the Providence National Stadium in time for the World Cup 2007. The installation of traffic lights. Today, the East Coast East Bank road linkage is being constructed by Ashoka Building Limited at a tune of $106 million. Recently, we acquired an ocean-going vessel to link Georgetown with Mabaruma Northwest District. The ferry, MV Malaysia, is now on its way to Guyana after being built by shipbuilders right here in India. In this year's budget, we are going to acquire 30,000 solar panels from India for hinterland communities. Linked to that is increase in trade. This is another significant area. And only last year, previously, the trade was a grave imbalance. We had far more Indian exports than Guyanese imports. But last year, because of our recent oil find, just imagine this, India has already purchased 2 oil finds from us. And right now, our exports in 21-22 is 156.96 million, thanks to those 2 oil finds. Linked to that also, recently in January, we had the visit of President Mohammed Irfan Ali, and he was able to sign a number of agreements with the Indian government. And I am aware that only last night, our Vice President has arrived in India with a high-level delegation to talk with government officials to further initiatives in relation to the oil and gas industry. And the point is that I would say at this point in time, the ties are at its peak. You know, its ties are very strong. Long live India-Guyana relations. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mangar, for this comprehensive overview of Indian, Guyana and Indian relations. I will ask the participants to try to stick to 20 minutes, but also I would like to ask the organizers if we can take a bit of time over lunch for the sake of equity between the 3 presenters that are in the panel with us now. So now from Guyana, we will move to Jamaica, thanks to Shalima Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago. So this is a very Caribbean panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste. First of all, I want to give my heartfelt gratitude to IIC and ICCR. Thank you. India is very important to us, and at every opportunity that we can get to be here, we really, really appreciate it. So thank you. I also want to say thank you so much to our High Commissioner, Dr. Roger Gopal, for affording me this opportunity to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm inviting you to walk back in time with me to 1905. Maharaji moved towards the neem tree, bowing at her deer on the bedi, saying a silent prayer and seeking Lord Hanuman's blessings. Ramasa again fell at the feet of his brother and Bauji, weeping, and asking how they could leave him. Once more, Jagasa Maharaji's husband pulled him to his feet, hugging him close and promising that he was leaving the cradle of his motherland, his muluk, his village of Karaundigao, the Janmabhoomi, but only for 5 years, after which he will return with his wife. He continued that he would earn enough money that he would make life easier for everyone upon his return. With flooded eyes and choking emotions, Jagasa, followed by the silent Maharaji, stepped out of the yard, past the well, and trudged down the grass track leading out of the village. 3 days later, on the 20th of April 1905, after a long journey to 21 Garden Reach Road, Calcutta, in the Kirapur Dock area, Jagasa and Maharaji registered as emigrants at the Jamaica Government Immigration Agency. The Jamaica depot was situated some 12.5 meters from the banks of the Hooghly River. As the sun was setting, the SS Indus, the ship, came alongside the dock, and Jagasa and Maharaji boarded along with 810 other passengers bound for Jamaica. Some 55 days after they set sail, the SS Indus docked at Port Maria in the parish of St. Mary's on the north coast of the island of Jamaica in the West Indies. A few days later, Ramasa and Maharaji began the new phase of their life on the Newry estate. And how do we know this? Because all of this would have happened in India. We know this because they never did come back to India. They eventually served their 5-year contract in Jamaica and would later move on to Trinidad, which is where I am from. This entire story was captured by their grandson, who is Ramesh Ramsaran, who worked at the University of the West Indies, who would have found their records and was able to come back and visit the village and so on in India. Now, why is this important? It's important because their story could very well never have been told unless Ramesh Ramcharan sought out the village and came to share. Reporting on his fieldwork, if you will just refer to the screen, please. Reporting on his fieldwork done in the western part of Jamaica over the period September 1996 to July 1967, Alan Ehrlich would have said, one does not find in rural Jamaica notions of caste, panchayat, patrilineal extended families, village exogamy, nor the practice or use of the Indian religious beliefs and languages. This was just in 1976 that he's reporting this. The majority of Jamaican Indians no longer identify with the same religious traditions of their ancestors. And this was a cause of concern for me. So here I want to look at the causes of this situation and its possible effects. And to ascertain the reasons for the dilution of religious identity among the Indo-Jamaicans in contemporary Jamaican society, I want to look at the reasons for Indian migration to Jamaica, first of all, the biracial and bireligious relations within Jamaican society, the impact of missionary activities, and Hindu and Islamic leadership. Why Hindu and Islamic leadership is because most of those who would have gone to the Caribbean would either have been Hindus or Muslims. The majority, the significant majority, were Hindus, a minority Muslims, and there were very few Christians who would have gone. So why did Indians migrate to Jamaica? Well, there are two ideas. One, manpower needs. This is the predominant reason that was advanced. We were told that it was to address the shortage of labor on the island post-slavery. However, Vereen Shepherd, and for those of you who know anything about the fight for reparations, Vereen Shepherd's name should be well known to you. She's the chair of several committees leading the reparation cause. She offered a different reason for Indian migration, and it had to do with planters' cheapness. She thought planters sanctioned immigration. They wanted to create competition for employment on Jamaican plantations, and so the lower wage and so on was to coerce the ex-slaves into working for wages which the planters deemed fair. So if you could pay somebody a little bit less, maybe the ex-slaves would have wanted those positions instead. So from India to Jamaica, on May 10th, 1845, this is when the first group of Indians would have left India bound for Jamaica. 200 men, 28 women, and 33 children under the age of 12 were on that very first voyage. After 17 weeks, 10 people died, unfortunately, and their histories we will never know about. But the rest, they would have gone on to Jamaica. 10 years after indentureship ended, indentureship formally ended in 1920, but the last ship that took Indians to the Caribbean was in 1917. So over the 71 years, 1845 to 1916, Jamaica received a total of 36,412 indentured Indians. By 1930, 17,599 of those Indians were settled in Jamaica on or close to the sugar estates and the banana plantations. And if you refer to the map, X marks the spot. It is on those particular estates, you will see St. Mary, Westmoreland, St. Catherine, Clarendon, Portland, and St. Thomas. By the early 20th century, this is where you had the highest concentration of Indians in Jamaica. So something would have happened with those who were living in Jamaica at the time, predominantly the ex-slaves, and the Indians when they would have come in. There would have been assimilation, there would have been acculturation, leading to biracial and bi-religious relations. So according to a communication in 1864, remember the first group of Indians went there in 1845, we are now in 1864, the coolie, as the Indians were called, the coolie does not mix freely with the black or even colored females on the island. But close proximity on the plantations would have facilitated intimate relationships to develop, and interracial relationships between Afro-Jamaicans and Indo-Jamaicans became increasingly common. Now, these were referred to as visiting relationships. They became more permanent very, very slowly. But in Jamaica, as in several parts of the Caribbean, no Indian man dared move his African spouse into the Indian settlement. That was a no-no. By 1999, however, almost half of the Indo-Jamaican population had marital or common law unions with Afro-Jamaicans, not necessarily happy marriages. This situation would have ultimately impacted interreligious relations, resulting in a dilution of traditional Indian religious practices. The Afro-Jamaicans, the vast majority of whom were Christian converts, were fascinated with the religious observances of the Indians. And this would have given rise to what is commonly known as the Rastafarianism in Jamaica. Hindus particularly would have influenced them, and Hindus purportedly provided the fundamentals of Rastafarian beliefs, ethics, codes, and practices. And from the picture you will see, at a Hindu temple in Jamaica, a Rastafarian is there performing arti along with this Hindu woman. It's not an obvious pairing, but this has been studied, and there was a documentary that was actually done showing the little-known connections between the Rastafari culture and the Hindu tradition in Jamaica. So the influence of the Hindus was noticed there. Now, José is common to those who follow Islam. It is a celebration that epitomizes Indo-Jamaican heritage. Initially, it was an all-Indian affair. African Creole members of the community were soon included. And this was found by David Stimson. Now, what happened was the number, again, I'm referring to the small number of Muslims that actually went to Jamaica. So when we got to Muharram and José was being celebrated, a lot of Hindus would have participated with the Muslims in the festivals. And then the Africans joined in. So today, the inclusion of Africans has become an integral part of the Jamaican performance of José. There's no record of the number of Afro-Jamaicans who so closely integrated into Indian religious life. But you can see from the picture the number of Africans there in the parades with the Indians. So although there were African Muslims who were among the slave population, Christian missionaries would have succeeded in converting the majority of them. And so when the Indians came is when there was some degree of revival of Islam in Jamaica. Let's talk about the missionary activities. They saw the religion of the Indians, and this is predominantly Hinduism, as being erroneous, barbaric, and irreligious. Jagasa resisted every attempt at conversion to Christianity, and possessing a good knowledge of the Ramayana and other Hindu scriptures, he would assemble on evenings with other Hindus at the barracks for religious discourses. But I want you all to pay particular attention to this. It was really relentless attacks by the missionaries on his religion and his culture that motivated him to leave Jamaica and move to Trinidad. So at the end of his first 5-year indentureship contract, he decided he could take no more of it. He wanted to be a Hindu. He left and he went to Trinidad with his wife. And there is where the rest of his family would have developed. So for some of the other Indians, though, conversion to Christianity was viewed as a necessity to their development. They would only find opportunities if they were Christians. Sovereign Shepherd, again, she argued that the nature of the Jamaican Indian community made it susceptible to aggressive missionary activities because it lacked structure, since there was neither temple in Jamaica for the Indian Hindus nor masjids for the Indian Muslims. And there was some truth to this. You see, during the period of indentureship, indeed, there were no mandars and no masjids that were constructed there. However, in 1957, Muhammad Khan built Masjid al-Rahman in Spanish Town. And you can see from the building, this is a reconstruction, yet it is still rudimentary. So you can just imagine what they started out with. That very first masjid would have been a very, very small building. Muhammad Khan would have come from Uttar Pradesh in 1915 at the age of 15 years. Masjid Hussein was constructed in 1916. This is a different one, at 3 Miles River in Westmoreland. The land was contributed by Aja Gulab, who came from India with his father at the age of 7 years. And I had the privilege of speaking with his great-grandson, Ahmad. So Ahmad was moved to assume leadership of that Jamaat, the one at which Masjid Hussein was built on lands donated by his great-grandfather. Upon his return to Jamaica, so Ahmad would have been born in Jamaica, he and his family, his siblings and so on, and they would have migrated from Jamaica. He would have spent 30-odd years in the US. He returned to Jamaica, and he found that only one member of his family was still a Muslim and was still attending the masjid that his great-grandfather would have donated lands to construct. So this moved him. He was intent on continuing with the tradition of his great-grandfather. He had some knowledge of Islam, but he confirmed that he learned about Islam during his time in the US rather than in Jamaica. So we can see the dilution of both Hinduism and Islam among the Indians in Jamaica. It is evident that there was a deficiency. The transfer of Islamic theology, ideology, worship, ethics, and the social system in Jamaica was really pronounced. In terms of Hinduism, the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha was formed in 1965 in Jamaica. They had some great influence in fostering Hinduism. They successfully constructed one of the 2 mandars which can be found in Jamaica. Construction began in Kingston in 1965. However, Winston Tolan, who is an Indian activist in Jamaica, he would have criticized the group, saying its many problems of management of money played a major role in detracting and demotivating many of the younger members of the Indian community from the pathways of their traditions. So there was some blame on missionaries, but there's also some blame to be given within the Indian community themselves as to why Hinduism, for example, did not continue. In 1993, the only surviving local pundit in Jamaica was Ramadan Maharaj. With the Hindu Samaj, he had some success in preserving Indian culture and was able to influence the Hindu community. We have Pandit Nathan Sharma. He was born in Westmoreland in 1947. His grandfather was a Pandit who served the Indian community in Cornwall, Friendship, and Hertford in Westmoreland during the 20th century. When his grandfather died, unfortunately, Hinduism in the parish died with him. So Pandit Nathan Sharma's family became Christians, and I'm calling him Pandit because he was indeed a Christian. Like Ahmad Gulab, he eventually studied Hinduism while he was practicing his Christian faith until 1977. He returned and he became a Pandit, however, with a difference. He says, my understanding from older siblings and others was that their grandfather came to Jamaica at a young age. He was the headman on the sugar estate and he was able to read and write but was not very fluent in English. He said he saw some of his grandfather's books in the Devanagari scripts. There were many. You will all recall that there was some great famine and disease, and this is how he encapsulates what happened in India, which would have created the situation to bring them to Jamaica. You will recall that there was great famine and disease going around, cholera. Half of the remainder of Indians died from the disease. The United Church, he does not remember the correct name, offered Indians a way out. They offered health, education, and nutrition, and the government at the time did not care. So he was a Christian. He accepted his Christian names. He said he studied Bible from cover to cover, but it did not give him the answer that he wanted. He was introduced to Hinduism, not by his grandfather, and that got him to think. So he would have returned. He says religion does not matter. What matters is God consciousness. So he's considered to be a Pandit, but in a different sense. So the religious identity of Indo-Jamaicans has been relegated to the celebration, essentially, of festivals. The Indian population in Jamaica differed from that of the Janmabhoomi because of interethnic and interreligious intimate partner relationships. There's a proliferation of Indian village life and sense of community, which is upheld by the tenets of Hindu and Muslim practices, but those were frustrated by the wide disbursement of the small numbers of Indians living in Jamaica. So religious fidelity is enforced more by the woman than the man in the household, which is why when interracial marriages became the norm, you had further dilution of Hinduism and Islam. So the African woman, while she might have been fascinated with Indian religious practices, she would have taught her children what she knew, which was African or Christian religion. And so the result was dilution of Indian practices. So there is some further research that needs to be done. The numbers clearly demonstrate that there has been a shift which occurred in religious identity. And so we need to question, is it possible that the Hindu and Muslim Indo-Jamaicans fall into a specific category? Are they afraid or ashamed to be identified as Hindu or Muslim Indo-Jamaicans? Or are they so few in number that they are inconsequential in Jamaican society? On the other hand, have Indo-Jamaicans integrated so well that they exist in the diverse group of Jamaican Christian churches? And so when we do the census, when we reflect on the census, you do not see Hindus and Muslims in Jamaica. They might exist, but within the Christian churches, simply for lack of numbers. So the research continues, and I hope I've enlightened you in some way. I'll take your questions if you have any. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shalima, for this. It's quite fascinating that you're bringing out the human dimension of this migration. The ideas of fusion, syncretism, transformation of the Indian presence in Jamaica raises the questions that you have left us with at the end of your presentation. So now we move from the history of migration to the history of ideas, and we will speak about this literary movement that has been so important in the world, but has had so much impact in India, magical realism. And José Mármol, poet from the Dominican Republic, will trace the roots of magical realism in poetry and in the Caribbean, because we usually associate magical realism with the novel and with a few iconic authors from continental Latin America. So over to you, José Mármol.
Gracias, buenos días. Quiero agradecer primero al India International Center la invitación a este importante evento, así como a nuestro embajador David Puig por su intermediación para estar presentes aquí hoy. A simple vista resultan demasiadas las páginas escritas y publicadas acerca del realismo mágico como uno de los acontecimientos estéticos y literarios más relevantes de la primera mitad y parte de la segunda mitad del pasado siglo XX en el contexto latinoamericano. Sin embargo, aproximarse a sus fuentes y replantearse las circunstancias económicas, políticas, culturales y sociales que rodearon la eclosión del realismo mágico en Latinoamérica y la de lo real maravilloso en el Caribe insular, significa la revelación de nuevos atributos e innegables aportes en el proceso de construcción, no solo de un nuevo lenguaje y una literatura identitaria, sino también de una nueva historia y una inédita realidad de naturaleza simbólica, narrada en cuentos, novelas o cantada en el poema de los pueblos de Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Sobre los orígenes de los términos realismo mágico y real maravilloso, se mantiene la disputa acerca del aporte seminal del crítico de arte alemán Franz Roh y su estudio sobre el postimpresionismo, con un marcado precedente del poeta romántico Novalis y su alusión a la magia y lo mágico, para el primer término, que van a inscribir en el contexto hispanoamericano Miguel Ángel Asturias y Uslar Pietri, así como la enunciación que de lo real maravilloso, como segundo término, va a desarrollar Alejo Carpentier en el prólogo a su novela El reino de este mundo. Ahora bien, Novalis, señalado como posible precursor de la noción estética de realismo mágico en Franz Roh, y el reconocimiento que los estudiosos tributan a poetas como Borges, más su perfil de narrador y ensayista en la literatura fantástica, Pablo Neruda y su poesía telúrica o surrealista, César Vallejo y Julio Cortázar como dos transformadores del lenguaje, así como también la presencia de José Lezama Lima como poeta, como ensayista y narrador en lo real maravilloso y en el ámbito caribeño, dan pie a la factibilidad de que pese a que aquello que la historia literaria ha destacado más como expresión de ambas posturas que unen lo real y lo mágico o maravilloso, sean la novela y el cuento, dando lugar al afamado boom latinoamericano de los años 60, la poesía se mantuvo en permanente y enriquecedor diálogo con estos. De hecho, Maurice Blanchot, en su apreciación del misticismo en William Blake, sustenta que para Novalis cada palabra es una entidad mágica. La literatura, especialmente en postulados como los sustentados por el naturalismo y el realismo europeos del siglo XIX, implica una aproximación simbólicamente interpretativa de la realidad. En Latinoamérica, a partir de las vanguardias de inicios del siglo XX, que en poesía dejan atrás el romanticismo y el modernismo para entrar en un proceso de rupturas expresivas e innovaciones formales, como por ejemplo el creacionismo de Huidobro y el ultraísmo español, el nuevo lenguaje literario que bebió en las fuentes del simbolismo y surrealismo franceses, va a significar una reconstrucción metafórica de las condiciones históricas, socioeconómicas y culturales muy vinculadas a la explotación de la tierra, al modelo patriarcal y al autoritarismo político en consonancia con los cambios que en el modo de producción capitalista vivió el continente latinoamericano y su relación con los Estados Unidos, mientras que Europa se desintegraba producto de dos guerras mundiales que cubrieron la primera mitad del pasado siglo. De ahí figuras emblemáticas y obras fundamentales como, voy solo a mencionar los nombres, Arturo Uslar Pietri, Juan Rulfo, Miguel Ángel Asturias, Gabriel García Márquez, Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar y en República Dominicana Juan Bosch, aunque este último está más relacionado con la llamada novela de la tierra, que como expresión realista precede al realismo mágico y al boom, en la que en los años 20 sobresalen figuras como Rómulo Gallegos y Ricardo Guiraldes, además de Horacio Quiroga. Si bien el artículo de Jorge Luis Borges titulado El arte narrativo y la magia, publicado en Discusión en 1932, tiene un valor germinal, la profundización conceptual en la relación entre realidad, magia o maravilla se debe sobre todo a Uslar Pietri en su obra ensayística Letras y Hombres de Venezuela, quien introduce el nombre de realismo mágico en la literatura hispanoamericana, y Alejo Carpentier con su variante de lo real maravilloso de 1949. Uslar Pietri da una nueva connotación al sujeto y su relación con la realidad, imprimiendo en el primero un aura de misterio. Para él, el lenguaje literario deberá procurar una adivinación poética o bien una negación poética de la realidad misma. Carpentier, por su lado, al pretender desmarcarse de los preceptos surrealistas en boga, va a plantear que la esencia de lo maravilloso estriba en su alteración inesperada de la realidad, una suerte de iluminación no habitual que va a favorecer una ampliación de las escalas y categorías de dicha realidad por medio de una exaltación del espíritu, de las creencias o de la fe. Nótese la valoración que del lenguaje y los preceptos poéticos llevan a cabo ambos escritores en sus respectivas conceptualizaciones, porque el abordaje de la realidad desde el plano mágico o maravilloso implica ineludiblemente una fundamentación de orden poético. La prosa de la novelística del realismo mágico y de lo real maravilloso es esencialmente poética, porque la poesía invita a la transgresión mítica e imaginaria de la realidad. En el famoso diálogo entre Vargas Llosa y Gabriel García Márquez de 1967 en Lima, el creador de 100 años de soledad, publicada en efecto ese mismo año, afirma que sus novelas son elaboraciones poéticas y que lo que en la región latinoamericana parece fantástico está extraído de la realidad. Simplemente está transpuesto poéticamente. No es casual que García Márquez testimoniara su enorme deuda, la deuda de su novelística con la poesía, durante su discurso al recibir el Premio Nobel de Literatura en 1982. Para Sandro Abate, el realismo mágico, que desde su óptica tiene una enorme deuda con Rubén Darío, y el modernismo, consistió en un movimiento americano cuya médula y principal eje temático es América, la búsqueda de su identidad, el buceo a través de su inconsciente continental, la percepción fenomenológica de su realidad y el rescate de su constitución antropológica y etnográfica plural. Ve sus principales exponentes en Asturias, Carpentier, Lezama Lima, Rulfo, García Márquez y Vargas Llosa, entre otros. El mestizaje va a constituir la clave de interpretación y fundamentación antropológica de la cuestión identitaria en la creación literaria de la primera mitad del siglo XX en nuestro continente. La reafirmación de esta tendencia hacia la recuperación del mito en nuestras culturas, con el sincretismo indígena, europeo y africano, más tarde el chino, especialmente en Cuba, va a dar al traste con el positivismo decimonónico, implicando una reapertura hacia lo espiritual, lo simbólico y lo mágico. El realismo mágico va a trascender los límites impuestos por el paradigma del realismo empírico positivista. Desde una perspectiva estilística, el realismo mágico y su vertiente caribeña insular de lo real maravilloso, esta última como apuesta por la separación de los presupuestos estéticos e ideológicos del surrealismo europeo, van a coincidir en una exaltación del valor significante, es decir, del lenguaje y sus formas como problema central de la expresión literaria, que redundará en la valoración del barroco, especialmente en su dimensión poética, pero con un marcado acento lingüístico, cultural e histórico hispanoamericano. El barroco hispanoamericano, desde su trasunto hiperbólico, significa un desbordamiento evocativo de la naturaleza y de la realidad. De ahí, por ejemplo, que el sincretismo cultural del Caribe insular de Carpentier y el mundo mítico de Macondo en García Márquez, más allá de las especificidades regionales o temporales y de los límites geográficos o históricos, se hayan convertido en universos culturales representativos de una cultura y un lenguaje estético coincidente, que pone en un primer plano la preeminencia simbólica del mito y de elementos del sincretismo cultural. Lo mismo ocurre con Lezama Lima y su novela Paradiso, que desde aquí, desde Nueva Delhi, Octavio Paz escribió a su autor en abril de 1967, que la leía poco a poco, con creciente asombro, y que definió como un edificio verbal de riqueza increíble, obra que cumple la promesa que le hicieron al español de América Sor Juana, Lugones y otros autores. Saúl Yurkiewicz afirma, con sobrada razón, que si el barroco europeo fue sinónimo de contrarreforma, el barroco americano lo fue de contraconquista. En su lectura de Lezama Lima y su noción poéticamente liberadora de la imago, define a esta como una fuerza animista y cohesiva, que llevará la imposible infinitud espacial a un posible de creación que descansa en el paisaje en tanto que espacio natural, cultural e histórico. Para Lezama Lima, el paisaje encarna el poder de crear la cultura y en el ámbito de la figuración se torna capaz de concitar su propia expresión. La imago es, en el escritor cubano, el verdadero motor de la historia, porque es a través de lo imaginario como se efectúan las realizaciones históricas. Y es en el barroco americano el que permite la realización de un estilo literario pleno, porque tensa, hincha, satura la imagen y la desafía a la configuración de su propia finalidad simbólica. El predominio de lo maravilloso, lo mágico frente a la realidad en la expresión literaria hispanoamericana de algo más de la primera mitad del siglo XX tiene lugar en un contexto histórico, económico, jurídico, político y social determinado, procedente de una centuria anterior cargada de colonialismo, guerras independentistas y de búsqueda de lo auténticamente americano en un contexto regional donde incluso el filósofo Hegel apostó, muy a pesar de que había relegado a América a una fase infantil de la historia, a que cobraría sentido en ella el futuro no solo del pensamiento, sino también de la humanidad. Hispanoamérica, de acuerdo con Lezama Lima, está destinada a integrar las grandes síntesis culturales. Lo interesante es que a partir del realismo mágico y de los postulados de lo real maravilloso, América Latina pasa a ser un territorio referencial de las letras con un imaginario y un lenguaje identitarios, es decir, propios, que persiguen la construcción de lo hispanoamericano y una visión integradora del ser americano. Más allá de las revueltas, revoluciones y conflictos en el ámbito político y social, así como de las particularidades de explotación y saqueo de las riquezas del continente por parte de naciones más poderosas, con un lastre colonial o imperialista, amén de la lucha que entre las clases tradicionales y oligárquicas y las clases emergentes, obrera y campesina, más los gobiernos autocráticos que tenían lugar en el siglo XX latinoamericano, resulta singularmente relevante el hecho estético de que lo imaginario, lo mágico, lo maravilloso y lo mítico fijaran las bases de un lenguaje disruptivo con el cual construir modelos simbólicos de esa misma realidad. Acontecimientos como la Revolución Mexicana de 1910 y la Revolución Cubana de 1959 en la segunda mitad del siglo XX, además con una marcada influencia ideológica, cultural y literaria en la región, del golpe de Estado de 1973 contra Allende en Chile, de la originaria Revolución Sandinista de 1979 en Nicaragua y de las dictaduras militares en el sur del continente, así como el golpe de Estado de 1963 en República Dominicana contra el escritor y político Juan Bosch, elegido democráticamente luego de más de 30 años de dictadura, cuyo reclamo de reposición en el poder desembocó en la Guerra de Abril de 1965 y la segunda intervención norteamericana del país, hechos estos que se fueron sucediendo como una suerte de destino, a veces macabro, para nuestros pueblos y que al mismo tiempo fueron conformando una suerte de fresco tallado por las expresiones poética y narrativa hispanoamericanas. Fenómenos fuera del continente, pero con incidencia en él, como las dos guerras mundiales europeas, la crisis económica de 1929, la guerra de Vietnam, la Guerra Fría y su consecuente polarización ideológica, entre otros, como el intervencionismo militar y la estrategia norteamericana de la Alianza para el Progreso de 1961, fueron determinantes para el decurso histórico latinoamericano y caribeño. La desigualdad económica y la inequidad social fueron y siguen siendo denominadores comunes de esos procesos en la región, frente a los cuales el arte y la literatura no fueron indiferentes. Tanto el realismo mágico, con la presencia dialógica de la poesía, como el boom en la novela, que como sugieren Vargas Llosa y García Márquez fue boom de lectores y no solo de escritores y editoriales, estuvieron acompañados, nunca condicionados por los fenómenos sociales, económicos y políticos de la región en los decenios del 60 al 80, con la característica esencial de una creciente participación de las clases populares en las reivindicaciones y transformaciones, incluyendo en el plano de las creencias el apogeo de la llamada teología de la liberación. En el Caribe hispánico insular, la relación dialógica entre narrativa, mágico-realista o realista maravillosa y poesía tiene expresiones muy particulares en movimientos poéticos de la primera mitad del siglo XX, como por ejemplo Orígenes en Cuba, a inicios de los años 40, el postumismo en los años 20, la poesía sorprendida y los llamados independientes del 40 en República Dominicana, más el idealismo y el noísmo en los años 20 y 30, así como el atalayismo independentista y el trascendentalismo en Puerto Rico en los años 50. En la brega por encontrar el lenguaje identitario de lo caribeño en la expresión literaria, búsqueda que como aventura de la lengua española en el variado contexto étnico, lingüístico y cultural latinoamericano tiene precedentes intelectuales profundos, como es el caso del dominicano Pedro Enrique Sureña y sus ensayos La Utopía de América y 6 ensayos en busca de nuestra expresión, a quien Borges de hecho llamó maestro de América, nos encontramos en el espacio de la poesía con el movimiento de la negritud, con Nicolás Guillén en Cuba, Luis Pález Matos en Puerto Rico y Manuel del Cabral, Tomás Hernández Franco y más tarde Manuel Rueda en República Dominicana. El Caribe hispánico insular da relieve a la negritud como un nuevo lenguaje poético identitario que en lengua caribeña francófona tendrá en MSC su mayor representante. ¿Cuál ha sido el legado del realismo mágico o del boom en la revolución de la literatura del Caribe hispánico insular, en especial la dominicana, hasta nuestros días? Vargas Llosa ha admitido un cambio fundamental de la novela latinoamericana desde el boom hasta nuestros días, al sustentar que la política ya no es de interés para los jóvenes escritores. Como parte de la evolución democrática del continente latinoamericano, la literatura ha experimentado un proceso de despolitización. El compromiso en literatura no es ahora ideológico, sino eminentemente literario. Incluso mediante la mezcla entre la fantasía y la autobiografía, el lenguaje narrativo se ha inclinado hacia una suerte de autoficción, terreno en el que el autor se vuelve personaje de la trama imaginativa. Si bien no hay que reducir este modo de ficción al intimismo, hay que reconocer que también el intimismo es político. Lo cierto es que el realismo sociopolítico tiene poco peso en la literatura posterior al realismo mágico y al boom. El tono testimonial, el impacto de los flujos migratorios, la transculturación y el lenguaje mismo como cuestión central de la escritura van a ocupar un lugar preponderante en la literatura posterior al boom y al barroco en el Caribe hispánico insular. Y algo muy importante, en su mayoría, los nuevos creadores, si bien son novelistas, también son poetas, lo que acerca todavía más la especificidad de ambas formaciones discursivas en una misma visión del hecho literario. Voy a saltar unas cuantas páginas para abreviar. Para finalizar, debo establecer alguna conexión entre uno que otros rasgos de la poesía de habla hispana y la literatura o la cultura de la India. Es bastante conocida la argumentación acerca de la influencia del poeta y filósofo Rabindranath Tagore, Premio Nobel de Literatura 1913, en la poesía juvenil del chileno Pablo Neruda, Premio Nobel de Literatura 1971. Aunque no he podido encontrar datos acerca de la presencia en el Caribe insular, sobre todo hispánico, de Tagore, en cambio sí es muy conocida en la historia de la literatura hispanoamericana su visita a Argentina en 1924, recibido por la escritora y editora Victoria Ocampo, y el interés que despertó su arribo en Jorge Luis Borges y los demás escritores en torno a la revista Sur, la intelectualidad argentina y, por supuesto, también la prensa. Si bien es cierto que Borges resalta el acontecimiento en su artículo titulado La llegada de Tagore, aparecido en la revista Proa en 1924, será sin embargo el insigne humanista dominicano Pedro Enríquez Ureña quien defenderá al maestro hindú de las adversidades e incomprensiones de la prensa y parte de la intelectualidad argentinas a través de un artículo de su autoría titulado Tagore y la civilización argentina, publicado en Valoraciones en 1924. Enríquez Ureña subraya que si acaso llegase a enterarse el poeta de la India, cuyo pensamiento se centró en Buda y en los Upanishads, en torno a esas críticas banales, le parecerán una nueva muestra de lo que es el mundo occidental, donde el egoísmo y la vanidad mueven a tales bajezas como si no bastaran los horrores a que nos empuja la persecución del dinero. Las críticas a Tagore a su paso por Argentina daban lástima, señaló el escritor dominicano. Más tarde, en junio de 1937, al reseñar el libro Poemas Selectos de Rabindranath Tagore para la revista El Hogar, Borges, en su tono casi siempre polémico y jactancioso, escribirá que 13 años atrás había tenido el honor, un poco terrible, de conversar con el venerado y melifluo Rabindranath Tagore. Se habló de la poesía de Baudelaire, alguien repitió La mort des amants, aquel soneto tan provisto de camas, de divanes, de flores, de chimeneas, de repisas, de espejos y de ángeles. Tagore lo escuchó con fortaleza, pero dijo al final, no me convence su poeta amueblado. Yo simpaticé, dice Borges, hondamente con él. Ahora, releyendo sus obras, he sospechado que lo movía menos el horror del bric-a-brac romántico que el invencible amor de la vaguedad. Considero, y termino, que de haber retomado el tema Tagore, su visita a Argentina y su inmensa obra literaria, esos 13 años después a los que alude Borges, el filólogo y crítico dominicano Pedro Enríquez Ureña hubiese rescatado al genio hindú de la ironía y del sarcasmo que caracterizaron al gran escritor argentino. De todos modos, con lo escrito y publicado en 1924, Enríquez Ureña tendió un puente de respeto, admiración y gratitud entre la República Dominicana y la India. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, hablo en español para continuando, siguiendo a José Mármol. Me parece muy interesante escuchar esta perspectiva desde el Caribe, de la evolución de la novela en nuestra región, desde el boom hasta nuestros días, y veo, y ustedes lo verán también, quienes escucharon a Jorge Volpi ayer, que hay muchos puntos de coincidencia en el, digamos, en el análisis que se hace, unos de ellos siendo la importancia que va tomando la literatura testimonial, documental, la autoficción y autobiográfica en nuestra región, y que no es solo un tema de nuestra región, lo hemos visto con la consagración, digamos, de la autoficción, con el premio Nobel a Nierno este año, que dicho sea de paso, visita la India en estos días, y creo que ahí lo interesante es preguntarnos y tal vez preguntarle a los expertos indios si se está viendo también en la India este giro hacia una literatura más íntima y más influenciada por lo biográfico. Well, I don't know if we have time for questions. This is for the organizers to tell us, because I think we've already taken some of the time of the lunch, but I see one hand raised. Maybe if we have a few minutes, I will give the floor to Professor Sonia Gupta.
Just a short comment and a question to Shalima, Mohammed's exposition, which was very, very interesting, which is about the religious identity. I differ with you just a little bit on the causes of the dilution of the religious identity of the Hindus and Muslims. Perhaps it's applicable to Jamaica, but my reading of the autobiographies of the indentured labor written in South Asian languages, very few of them, for example, the Holy Songs of Demerara by Lal Bihari Sharma from British Guyana, and Munshi Rahman Khan's autobiography, of course that's Suriname, but still Caribbean to a great extent, show that the dilution of caste and community, particularly caste, the fact that a low caste had to, and the Brahmin had to live together in the quarters, etc., contributed in a big way in the dilution of one of the major pillars of the Hindu religion, which is the caste system. Because all of these people were thrown into living together, the Brahmin had to finally, accept certain norms, which. So I think this is a very Western narrative that it is the Christian missionary activity which diluted Hindu religion. I think there were other reasons too. So that's one. What would your reaction be? And to say that, some of these sources which are available, very few, because you have mentioned some grandsons and grandchildren, actually reporting on what their granddads or grandmoms had told. So therefore, I think as sources of subaltern history, some of these autobiographies which were published way back in 1916, 1920s, etc., should be included in the study on the religious identity of the Caribbean Indians. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment and your question. First of all, there's a question mark over whether or not Brahmins actually did come to the Caribbean, whether they were indeed Brahmins, because when they were recruiting for indentureship, they actually had a number of criteria that the indentured immigrants would have had to satisfy. So those who might have come may not necessarily have been Brahmins. They actually were workers posing as those who would have some more in-depth knowledge about the religion. Secondly, I did not only attribute it to missionary activities. That indeed played a part, but it was certainly not the only part. And we also have to look at the some of the older heads did have to take responsibility for not perhaps teaching the younger ones. You have to remember that in these circumstances, being Indian, being Hindu, being Muslim was not necessarily the best way for you to progress in the evolving society. And I appreciate your comment, but again, missionary activities was not the only cause for the dilution of religious identity. Thank you.
Any other question? I see two hands raised, so we have time for both, I think. So please, from Guatemala, ¿no?
Así es. Buenas tardes, soy Fernando Valdivieso de Guatemala y con el señor José Mármol. Yo como artista plástico me considero un heredero directo del realismo mágico de la literatura latinoamericana. Actualmente, ayer precisamente inauguré una exposición de mis dibujos en la Embajada de Guatemala aquí en Delhi, en Nueva Delhi, y me llamó mucho la atención el especial énfasis que usted hizo en la figura de Miguel Ángel Asturias. Tengo la fortuna de ser, tengo una relación muy especial con un sobrino de Miguel Ángel Asturias, que es Gonzalo Asturias. Es escritor, periodista y el único descendiente de la familia Asturias que se dedicó a la literatura. por él he tenido obviamente acceso a mucha información directa de primera mano del maestro Asturias, Miguel Ángel, y afortunadamente también tuve ya no hay mejor contacto con la vida y la esencia de un artista, en este caso un artista literario, no hay mejor contacto que el contacto directo con su obra. Pero tuve también la fortuna de la primera vez que, hace 3 años que estuve en París presentando una exposición de mi trabajo, pude ir a rendirle un homenaje a la tumba del maestro Asturias en el Père Lachaise del cementerio de París, porque es un escritor de una grandeza tremenda. Yo entiendo que usted, señor Mármol, tiene un proceso de investigación profundo al respecto de la literatura latinoamericana y de la función que el maestro Asturias, o el aporte de Asturias a la literatura contemporánea o la literatura moderna latinoamericana. Esto no era una pregunta, era más bien quería ponerme a sus órdenes por si usted en algún momento quisiera tener el teléfono de Gonzalo Asturias para tener información de primera mano, acceso a documentos y muchas cosas de las que la familia, que esta familia está haciendo una fundación precisamente en Guatemala, una fundación para Miguel Ángel Asturias, para la conservación de su legado y la difusión de su obra. Así que era solamente eso, más bien quería como introducirme como un nexo entre los Asturias de Guatemala actuales. Se está terminando también la tradición asturiana en la familia, es decir, Miguel Ángel Asturias, que vive en Buenos Aires, y Gonzalo, su sobrino, que vive en Guatemala, les importa realmente Miguel Ángel Asturias y su valor dentro de la literatura de nuestro continente. Así que pues quiero hacer como un hilo de contacto entre la labor que usted hace, señor Mármol, y la familia Asturias. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. No sé si quieres responder algo, José, pero creo que esto es…
Agradecer simplemente, porque yo creo que estamos hablando de una figura fundamental de la literatura hispanoamericana y todo lo que se pueda investigar, enriquecer sobre él será siempre importante, ¿no?
Y agrego solamente que esto es importante para la República Dominicana, para el señor José Mármol, pero creo también para todos los investigadores indios que también se interesan por la obra de Miguel Ángel Asturias y la literatura de Centroamérica y del Caribe. Le doy la palabra simplemente… Y estuvo aquí, claro.
Estaba enterándome de una publicación de Asturias con su señora, lo que no sé si es la primera esposa o la esposa argentina. Hicieron ellos en conjunto un libro sobre la experiencia